Emma had always been a simple woman with a very clear desire to give her son, Lucas, a better life. Before his birth, her life was a succession of temporary jobs and debt. She never considered herself lucky, but clung to one certainty. She would do anything to see Lucas smile. That morning, the day seemed like any other. She woke up early, gave breakfast to Lucas, who couldn't yet speak, but already demonstrated an unusual intelligence for his age. He seemed to observe the world around him in detail, as if he already had a deep understanding of things. Emma, however, didn't pay much attention to it. Her life revolved around the daily struggle to earn enough money to pay the bills and give her son a future. But all that began to change on a seemingly ordinary day. She was working as an assistant at an antique dealer in Manhattan, trying to find something valuable among the antique furniture and objects. That day, the antique dealer brought in a peculiar object, a small gold sculpture that at first glance didn't seem any more valuable than other pieces in the shop. However, upon seeing the object, Lucas, who was in her lap, began to cry and move agitatedly, as if drawn to the sculpture. Intrigued, Emma picked up the object to try and calm her son, but as soon as she did, Lucas instantly stopped crying. Emma didn't know what was happening, but something strange was in the air. The piece seemed to emit a subtle, almost magical energy, and Lucas seemed to sense it with a sensitivity she had never seen before. This was the first sign that something unusual was happening to her son, and from that moment on, her life would take an unexpected turn. The antique dealer, noticing the baby's reaction, suggested that the sculpture be sold. He commented with an enigmatic smile that the piece had a very old history and was linked to a mysterious collector. The antique dealer didn't know the exact value of the piece, but he mentioned it with such respect that Emma, in her mind, began to speculate that it could be her chance to escape poverty. Without knowing what was behind Lucas's reaction, Emma had an idea that made her hesitate. If her son somehow had a special gift for identifying valuable items, this could be the key to changing her life and his forever. But Emma didn't yet know that this would only be the beginning of a journey that would reveal much bigger secrets, placing her at the center of a game of power and wealth involving people with far more sinister interests than she could imagine. Emma never imagined that upon receiving that golden sculpture, her life would take such a surreal turn. She had always lived in a reality where financial difficulties dictated her pace. But now, with Lucas in her arms, she felt that something was changing inside her, something she couldn't explain. The antique dealer, a man of sophisticated appearance and measured speech, was someone Emma had never heard of before. His name was Samuel Ashford, a name that seemed to carry a weight she couldn't comprehend. Always well-dressed and with a distant look, Ashford seemed to know something Emma didn't. When he spoke to her about the sculpture's value, his words seemed deliberate, as if he were testing Emma in some way. "This piece is more than gold, my lady. It has a history that few know." Emma tried to understand what he meant, but her mind was too preoccupied with possibilities. Somehow, she knew that this piece could be the answer to all her worries. She had heard of antique dealers who dealt with eccentric collectors, but nothing compared to the air of mystery that Ashford carried. In the days that followed, Emma became increasingly focused on Lucas's strange ability. With each valuable object she showed her son, he reacted in the same way. His eyes lit up, his hands stretched out, and his body seemed to vibrate with an energy Emma had never witnessed before. She didn't know what to make of it, but the idea that her son might have a superpower began to take root in her mind. It was a disconcerting yet fascinating feeling. During a moment of reflection, Emma began to think about what the antique dealer had said about the piece and the mysterious collector. She had little information about it, but curiosity consumed her. Part of her wanted to investigate further, but another part wondered if it might be dangerous. After all, she was dealing with a world very distant from her everyday reality. Meanwhile, Lucas continued to surprise her. He who could barely speak now seemed to discern details about the things he touched, especially when it came to valuable objects. Emma began to wonder if he was simply a child prodigy, or if there was something more to it. But what intrigued her most was the fact that Lucas's abilities seemed to intensify with each rare object he touched, as if, somehow, he were able to sense the history and value of each item. Deep down, Emma knew she was at a crossroads. On one hand, she wanted to use Lucas's ability to secure a comfortable life for both of them, but on the other, a small voice in her head warned her that this power could attract unwanted attention. It wouldn't be long before people with darker intentions wanted to use it. She sensed that something bigger was coming. Emma's dilemma deepened as she began to consider her options. She could try selling the items Lucas had identified, which, in theory, could make her rich quickly. But she also knew that with that kind of wealth would come dangers. She didn't want Lucas to be used or manipulated by unscrupulous people, as seemed to be the case with Ashford. Even though he appeared to be just an antique dealer, something about his behavior told her he was involved in something much bigger and darker. While Emma struggled with these doubts, the world around her began to transform. People she never imagined meeting started appearing, offering her large sums of money in exchange for information about what Lucas knew. Emma, despite being an astute woman, began to realize that her son, with his unusual gifts, would become the center of a relentless dispute. But she had no intention of being intimidated. She would protect Lucas at all costs. As the days passed, Emma and Lucas's lives began to change in an unusual way. Lucas's power, though still an enigma, became increasingly evident. Her ability to identify valuable items drew people from all over Manhattan to her. It wasn't long before, with the help of an art dealer who appeared somewhat mysteriously, Emma began selling antique pieces to wealthy and famous collectors. But it wasn't just the money that was arriving. Curious glances, veiled observations, and even veiled threats were also beginning to surface. Lucas's power did not go unnoticed by those seeking something rare, something only he could identify. Emma soon realized she was sinking into a dangerous game, and that the desire for wealth was attracting more than she could control. The first direct threat came when a middle-aged man, with the air of a businessman, appeared at the shop where she worked. His name was Richard Carver, an investor who specialized in rare antiques. He knew of Lucas's skill and, in a seemingly cordial conversation, tried to convince Emma to hand over her son to him for a series of more in-depth tests. Carver was not a man who cared about morality or ethics. He wanted Lucas at all costs. "I can make your son famous, Emma. Think of what he could achieve. Think of what he could give us," Carver said with a calculating smile. Emma felt a chill down her spine. He spoke of Lucas as if he were an object, a commodity. But Emma wasn't foolish. She knew she couldn't give in to that kind of pressure, even though the money Carver promised was tempting. She turned him down, but deep down, she knew he wouldn't give up so easily. Richard Carver was a predator, and Lucas was the prey. Meanwhile, the presence of antique dealer Samuel Ashford became more constant. Instead of distancing himself, he seemed to get closer and closer to Emma, offering her advice and, in some cases, suggesting how she could take advantage of Lucas. What seemed to be a friendship began to reveal itself as something much more manipulative. Emma, though cautious, knew that Ashford had something more to offer, and that something might be exactly what she needed to protect her son and ensure a secure future for both of them. However, she felt that he was not only interested in Lucas's well-being, but also in something much darker. Behind his enigmatic words and imperturbable demeanor, Ashford had an agenda of his own. He was connected to a secret circle of collectors and connoisseurs of rare artifacts, some of whom were more interested in harnessing Lucas's power than in his ability to identify objects. Emma knew that if she wanted to escape this web of intrigue and protect Lucas, she would have to play a far more dangerous game. The conflict reached its peak when Emma received a letter with no return address, but bearing a stamp she immediately recognized, the emblem of an exclusive collectors' club. The letter, written in an old curved script, simply stated, "We know what your son can do. He will be ours, or he will belong to no one." That was the turning point. Fear began to grip Emma, but she knew she couldn't allow Lucas to be dragged into the center of a conspiracy she didn't fully understand. She needed to protect her son, even if it meant making choices that distanced her from people who seemed to be her allies, like Samuel Ashford. The threats, once subtle, were now becoming increasingly clear and direct. Richard Carver reappeared, this time with a stern-faced bodyguard, accompanied by a bag full of money. "The decision is made, Emma. We can't wait any longer. Lucas is a valuable asset. Don't do anything that will force us to act otherwise," he said, the implicit threat hanging in the air. Emma, her heart pounding, looked at Lucas. She knew that, by his side, there was no turning back. A world of wealth and power lay at her door, but with it came shadows and dangers. She stood on the edge of an abyss, and the more she tried to look ahead, the closer she saw the danger approaching. Now, more than ever, she needed to decide how far she was willing to go to secure Lucas's future. But before she could take any action, one thing became clear. The game she was playing now wasn't just about wealth. It was about survival. Emma was becoming increasingly immersed in a whirlwind of shady dealings and veiled threats. While the battle for Lucas was the central issue, there was something else at stake that she still couldn't fully understand. The truth behind the old pieces and the power her son held. While she was trying to protect Lucas, a figure from her past, an old friend named Thomas, began to appear in the shadows. Thomas was a former college classmate of Emma's, an intellectual who, after years of career frustration, had become an art historian. He had always had a peculiar interest in rare artifacts, and had shared with Emma, many years before, his theory about certain objects possessing powers. At the time, she had dismissed it as fantasy, but now, seeing what Lucas was capable of, his words began to make sense. Thomas approached Emma during a moment of growing tension when she could barely sleep or think clearly. "Emma, I know you have something powerful, and you're not alone in this. I have sources. I can help you understand what's happening," he said, with a seriousness she had never seen before. He spoke with a conviction that sent a chill down Emma's spine. Thomas wasn't just offering help. He seemed to know more about the rare artifacts than Emma had imagined. He had been warned by a former colleague, a scholar who was now missing, about a secret sect that was after objects that not only had historical value, but also mysterious powers. Emma didn't know if she could completely trust Thomas, but the urgency of the situation led her to accept his help. He suggested that to protect Lucas, she would need to discover the origin of his power and how it was connected to these objects. Meanwhile, Samuel Ashford's interests began to reveal themselves in an even more disturbing way. He wasn't just an antique dealer. In fact, he had deep connections to the circle that sought to control these artifacts. One night, Emma received an encrypted message from an anonymous source warning her about Ashford's true role. She still didn't know if she could trust the message, but what it suggested was unsettling. Ashford was part of a global network of collectors who used these pieces to seek absolute power. They believed that whoever controlled the rarest pieces could obtain a form of immortality. Emma felt like a piece on a chessboard, where everyone was playing for their own benefit, and she and Lucas were at the center of this deadly struggle. Furthermore, there was the matter of Richard Carver. He was no longer hiding in the shadows. Now he was beginning to act aggressively, with direct approaches and clear intentions. During a meeting, he pressured Emma, offering her a large sum of money to hand over Lucas and the pieces he had identified. Carver was no longer disguising his predatory nature. He knew Lucas had something unique, and he wasn't willing to let another collector, or worse, an ordinary person, possess it. Emma, among all the options, now saw her only chance to protect Lucas through an alliance with Tomas. However, he was also taking a risk by getting involved with her. The members of the sect that Ashford represented would not be easily stopped, and time was running out. With each passing day, the pressure on Emma increased. She could no longer remain on the defensive. The time to act had come. With Tomas's support, Emma decided to follow a lead. He had discovered about a secret auction where rare items would be sold to a select group of collectors. There, she believed she would find answers about the origins of Lucas's powers, and perhaps a way to neutralize the growing threat. But at the same time, she knew this could also be the final trap. The questions now weighing on her were more urgent. Who was really in charge, and how far would she go to protect her son? As she prepared for what was to come, Emma felt the weight of her choices. It wasn't just about protecting Lucas from people like Ashford and Carver. Now she knew that Lucas's own future was at stake. The power he possessed was not something that could be easily controlled. And what Emma didn't know was that by taking the next step, she was about to enter a minefield where the enemies weren't just those she knew. There was something darker that she hadn't yet understood, and the truth about Lucas was further away than she had ever imagined. The pressure on Emma increased daily. The search for answers about Lucas, the antique pieces, and the circle of secret collectors became increasingly agonizing. She felt trapped, with allies and enemies blurring together in a confusing way. Samuel Ashford continued to subtly but persistently approach her, while Richard Carver, with his aggressive approach, seemed willing to go to any lengths to get what he wanted. But Emma had no more time to hesitate. Something needed to change, and fast. It was on a cold November night, while Emma was at Tomas's apartment, that the turning point finally occurred. They had spent the day investigating a series of old documents, trying to find clues about the origin of Lucas's power. Suddenly, a phone call interrupted the rising tension. The number was unknown, but the voice on the other end made Emma freeze. "You don't know the real story of what's happening, Emma," said a deep, female voice. "I'm the one you were looking for." Emma couldn't understand what she was hearing. The voice seemed to come from somewhere deep, as if it carried secrets hidden for years. "Who are you? What do you know about my son?" The woman on the other end laughed softly, as if she knew Emma was completely lost. "I'm someone who knows Lucas's true legacy. He's not just a baby with superpowers like you think. He's the key to something much bigger, something you can barely imagine." The call was abruptly cut off, but the message had been clear. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at Tomas, who was just as stunned as she was. Who was this woman, and what did she mean by legacy? Emma asked, with a growing sense that she had touched something very dangerous. Tomas was silent, processing the information. He knew there was more to Lucas's story than he had imagined, but he never imagined he was dealing with something so profound. The woman on the phone didn't seem to be a simple ally or enemy. She seemed to know all the secrets that were being kept in the shadows. At that moment, a sense of urgency gripped Emma. She knew she could no longer wait to understand everything before acting. Whatever was lurking was now in motion. And from that moment on, Emma knew that any misstep could put Lucas at risk. His power was not something that could be used for personal gain. There was something bigger at stake. It was then that the apartment door opened abruptly. Samuel Ashford appeared, with a smile that Emma now saw as pure manipulation. He was accompanied by two men who seemed more like bodyguards than allies. The tension in the air was palpable. Ashford looked at Tomas with a look full of contempt before turning to Emma. "I knew you'd get to this point, Emma. I knew that sooner or later you'd start to see what's really at stake," Ashford said with disconcerting calm. "Did you know, Ashford?" Emma replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though she felt a knot in her stomach. "What do you really want with my son?" Ashford smiled enigmatically, as if finally revealing the truth. "He's not the one you should fear, Emma, and I'm not the real enemy. You're about to discover that if Lucas isn't brought under control, whatever is behind all this will destroy you all." Before Emma could process her words, Ashford's security guards moved in, and the situation took an even more dangerous turn. The last thing she saw was Thomas being pushed aside, trying to fight back. Then a loud explosion echoed outside, bringing everything to a halt. The apartment window shattered into 1,000 pieces, and a cloud of smoke filled the room. Emma felt the force of the impact, and before she could understand what was happening, she was thrown to the ground, the sounds of screams and footsteps growing ever more distant. She tried to stand up, but she was dizzy. What on earth was happening? Who had done this? When she managed to focus her thoughts, the only thing Emma knew was that there was a greater force moving in the shadows. Whatever it was, it didn't want her to find out the truth. Lucas, her son, the center of everything, was now in grave danger, and Emma was about to discover that, however hard she tried to protect him, something far darker was on the way, something that could destroy not only their lives, but the entire power structure that existed behind the curtains of society. The explosion that destroyed part of Tomas's apartment was just the beginning of a series of events that quickly turned into an uncontrollable nightmare for Emma. The deafening crack of the explosion still echoed in her ears when she managed to compose herself and look around. The apartment, which had previously seemed a safe and temporary refuge, was now in ruins. Broken glass, overturned furniture, and a dense cloud of dust obscured her vision. Emma smelled the fire and felt the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She struggled to her feet, her head spinning and her body still dazed. Tomas was beside her, his expression panicked. He seemed shocked, but even so he tried to stand up. "Emma, what was that?" he asked, trying to wipe away the blood that trickled from a cut on his forehead. "I don't know, but we have to get out of here now," Emma said, her voice trembling but determined. She knew the situation had changed irreversibly. The explosion wasn't an accident. Someone wanted her to pay for something, maybe for seeking answers, or maybe because they knew Lucas was the key to something much bigger. But before she could take a step, reality hit her like a punch to the gut. She looked at where Lucas lay, in the makeshift crib next to the room, protected by the walls that miraculously had withstood the impact. The baby was awake, his eyes fixed on Emma, but he seemed different, more alert. There was a tension in the air, as if he knew something was wrong. Emma ran to him, urgently taking him in her arms. But before she could leave the apartment, the front door was violently opened. Two men entered, armed and with impassive faces. Emma recognized one of them immediately. They were Richard Carver's bodyguards. They were there to ensure she didn't escape. "Do you really think you can get away now, Emma?" one of the guards said, his voice cold and menacing. He stepped forward, but Emma didn't hesitate. With Lucas in her arms, she stepped back, pressing against the wall to get away from them. "You can't do this! You don't know what you're up against!" Emma screamed, desperate. But the men didn't seem to care. They advanced, blocking the exit. It was at that moment that the true gravity of the situation became apparent. The men weren't there just to capture her. They were there to take Lucas, to seize the power he possessed. Emma now knew they weren't just hunting her or the baby for money or status. There was something much deeper and more sinister at stake. They were interested in Lucas's power, in what he could do. And she was beginning to realize that perhaps in reality, not even Samuel Ashford was the greatest enemy. While she was trying to remain calm, the apartment door was forced open, and two other men entered, more aggressive and with determined expressions. "Get out of the way, or we'll do this the hard way," one of them said. Emma knew she couldn't fight four armed men, much less with Lucas in her arms. But what she did have was a quick mind and a will to survive at any cost. When one of the men tried to step towards her, Lucas suddenly began to emit a strange vibration, almost like a low hum, and his eyes shone with unusual intensity. The security guards paused for a moment, surprised. Emma looked at her son, who now seemed to have completely absorbed the fear and tension of the moment. It was as if he knew exactly what was at stake. "Don't go near him!" Emma shouted, and in the next instant, the vibration intensified. The light in Lucas's eyes grew brighter, like a pulsating energy emanating from him. The stunned security guards began to back away, but not far enough. It was then that Emma realized she wasn't just protecting Lucas from an external threat. She was witnessing living proof of her son's power, the power that would undoubtedly be the key to everything, but also the curse that made them targets. Her first reaction was panic, but it quickly turned into action. With the speed she didn't know she possessed, Emma ran toward the broken window. "Let's get out this way," she shouted to Tomas, who was still dazed. They didn't have much time. As she moved, Lucas's power seemed to reach its peak. The pressure in the room increased, as if the energy emanating from him was about to be unleashed in a devastating way. But before Emma could reach the window, the security guards reacted. "Grab her! Don't let her escape with the boy!" one of them shouted. In a last-ditch effort, Emma grabbed what she could, a broken chair, and used it for defense as she leaped out the window. The sound of the shattering glass was muffled by the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Outside, the chaos continued. But Emma no longer had time to hesitate. She had a son to protect, and from that moment on, her life would never be the same. The streets of Manhattan were a frantic labyrinth of flashing lights and muffled sounds. But for Emma, all that mattered was escape. She held Lucas tightly in her arms, and her eyes, now more alert and attentive than ever, were fixed on the horizon. The fear was palpable, but something else was rising within her, a determination she never imagined she possessed. She knew she couldn't keep running. The game had changed, and now she was the one controlling the steps they would take toward the future. Beside her, Tomas looked exhausted, but at the same time more resolute than before. They had crossed busy streets, hidden in dark alleys, and evaded several attempts at capture. However, the feeling of being followed was constant. Lucas's power, though still a mystery, seemed to be both a blessing and a curse. Now that he was awake and reacting so intensely, Emma knew he was no longer just a baby. He was the key to something much bigger, and also the reason they were being hunted. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had a mission now, to protect Lucas, and finally find out what was happening to him. But to do that, she would need to change the way she dealt with the threats around her. Fear could no longer control her. She had to be smarter, faster, more strategic. Despite his exhaustion, Tomas was also beginning to transform. He was no longer the intellectual who had approached Emma out of mere curiosity. He was now deeply involved in protecting Lucas and shared with her the responsibility of unraveling the mysteries surrounding the boy's power. The relationship between the two, once casual and friendly, was now becoming closer. They were on the same team, and there was no room for weakness. "Emma, we need to find out more about the origin of Lucas's power," said Thomas, looking at her with a seriousness he had never shown before. "I found some clues in old documents, but there's still a lot we don't know. We need to act fast before they find us." Emma nodded, her mind already working on strategies. "I know, Thomas, but we can't do this alone. We have to find allies, and at the same time, we need to hide Lucas. They already know about his power, and the longer we remain in their sight, the more danger we are in." But instead of continuing to run, she began to realize that the game wasn't just about running or hiding. It was about understanding Lucas's power and using it to her advantage. This meant exploring new ways to defend herself, to move through the shadows, without anyone being able to predict her next moves. The first step in this happened on a cold night while they were taking refuge in a rented apartment under a false name. Emma was sitting at the table, studying the documents that Tomas had found, when an idea came to her mind. Perhaps the secret to protecting Lucas was closer than she imagined. Perhaps instead of running away, it was time to confront those who were after them. She stood up determinedly. "Thomas, we're going in the wrong direction. We need to start attacking." Thomas looked at her surprised. "Attack? Emma, are you saying we should confront the collectors directly?" Emma took a deep breath. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but the days of running were over. She couldn't live in fear anymore, and more importantly, she couldn't allow Lucas to be used as a tool by people who didn't care about him. They were dealing with something bigger, and she knew that to survive, they needed to be bolder. Yes, we need to understand what they really want. We need to attack where it hurts, find out what they're trying to hide, and use that against them, Emma said, a glint of determination in her eyes. As she prepared to take control of the situation, Emma felt for the first time that she was evolving. The fragile and frightened woman who had only sought to save her son's life was giving way to a fierce mother, willing to do anything to protect Lucas. She was no longer a victim, she was a survivor. This transformation wasn't just a reaction to imminent danger, it was a response to her own inner journey. Emma was beginning to understand that to protect Lucas, she would need to be more than a mother. She needed to be a strategist, a woman capable of confronting the threat head-on, without hesitation. This meant harnessing Lucas's power, not just as a source of fear, but as a key to turning the tables in her favor. With the plan in mind, Emma and Thomas began working on a new objective: to infiltrate the collector's network and discover the truth behind Lucas's power. To do this, they needed to disguise themselves, manipulate information, and get close to their enemies without them knowing their true intentions. Lucas, even as just a baby, now seemed more aware of his power. Emma was beginning to sense that he possessed not only rare abilities, but something more, something that, if understood and controlled correctly, could change the course of history. She was ready for the next phase of this journey. And for the first time, she knew there was no turning back. The power she now possessed, the strength of her determination, the intelligence gained in the struggle for survival, would be the only thing that kept her alive. The clock seemed to tick faster than ever. Emma and Thomas had worked tirelessly in recent days, fine-tuning the details of a daring plan. They knew that the only way to turn the tables in their favor was to infiltrate directly into the network of collectors of rare artifacts, a closed circle where Samuel Ashford and Richard Carver wielded monstrous influence. There was no more room for doubt or hesitation. The next step could not be postponed. "Are we ready for this?" Emma asked, her voice firmer than she felt, but her confidence was growing. She was beginning to understand the power game she was in, and now she knew she could no longer act alone. Thomas, beside him, was equally tense, but determined. "I think so. We got the fake credentials for the secret auction, and with that, we can infiltrate the buyers. But we know that will attract attention. They'll recognize us from somewhere. We need to be quick and discreet." Emma nodded, looking at Lucas, who was silently in her arms, more alert and even more mysterious than ever. She knew he wasn't just a baby. His power was growing, and she was beginning to understand that he could be the key to all of this, to discovering what Ashford and the others were seeking, and possibly to destabilizing the power system they found themselves in. "Thomas," she began, her voice tense, "if something goes wrong, what will we do? We're in their territory now. We can't underestimate who we're facing." He looked at her seriously, his eyes now deeper, as if he had absorbed the gravity of the situation. "If something goes wrong, we'll improvise. But first of all, we need to understand what they want from Lucas. We need to know his real story. His power is the key, and we have to find out once and for all what's behind it." Emma didn't answer immediately, her thoughts turning to the mysterious call she'd received weeks ago. "The woman who called me," she said suddenly. "She knew something. She knew about Lucas, and everything she said was related to what we're trying to find out. But she never identified herself. Who do you think she is?" Thomas asked, his voice falling. I don't know, but I know she's behind all of this, and if we can get to her, we'll have answers, Emma said, her eyes now fixed on the void. The weight of what was to come was still immense, but she was already going so deep that she couldn't turn back. The plan was set. They would infiltrate the rare artifact auction, disguised as buyers. They didn't know exactly what they would find there, but they knew that this would be the key to discovering what their enemies were planning. Emma felt her heart race at the thought of the risks involved. To win this game, she would need to use everything she had learned so far. Every move, every word, every glance would have to be calculated with precision. As night drew near, Emma felt a growing pressure. Something was about to happen, a great revelation or a great loss. She knew her life would never be the same again, but at that moment there was no turning back. She was more determined than ever to protect Lucas and uncover the truth, no matter the cost. On a cold, dark night, the secret auction took place. In a secluded mansion outside the city, the guests were all powerful figures who moved in elite circles. Emma and Thomas arrived ahead of schedule, their disguises perfectly in place, but Emma sensed the air was thick with tension. It wouldn't be long before the security guards began to close in, and Emma knew that at any moment someone might recognize them. What she didn't expect was Richard Carver's presence there. He was among the buyers, and his gaze was already searching for her. "He's here, Carver," Thomas whispered, panicked. "He knows we're around. This could ruin everything." Emma took a deep breath but didn't back down. "We have no choice. Stay close to me and don't lose sight of Lucas." With Lucas still in her arms, Emma strode toward the main hall where the rare artifacts were displayed. She glanced at the assembled figures, trying not to be noticed, but the heat of the tension was palpable. Every minute there could be their last. She and Tomas needed to act fast. The room was lit with crystal chandeliers, and the atmosphere was steeped in obscure wealth. Emma couldn't help but wonder how many lives had been destroyed for those objects to arrive there. As she watched the other buyers, one name echoed in her mind: Samuel Ashford. If she could reach him, she would have the opportunity to expose him and finally understand the true extent of Lucas's power. But Carver's eyes wouldn't leave her. The pressure was mounting. The auction would soon begin, and time was against them. The hall was filled with high-ranking figures, a veritable parade of power and wealth. The rare objects, gleaming under the golden lights of the chandeliers, were more than mere collectibles. They were symbols of status, of obscure conquests, and of treacherous ambitions. Emma mingled with the crowd, each step taken with precision. Tomas stood beside her, more tense than ever, his eyes fixed on every movement around them. Richard Carver, seemingly unaware of their presence, stood just a few feet away, and Emma couldn't help but notice his impassive demeanor as he conversed with other buyers. But the real threat was closer. Samuel Ashford, the man who had so skillfully manipulated the situation, stood in the center of the room, observing everyone with an unsettling calm. He didn't look directly at Emma, but she felt his gaze fixed on her, like prey about to be captured. Adrenaline coursed through her veins. She and Tomas had done their part. They had infiltrated the operation. Now they needed to move forward, understand what was happening, and above all, uncover the truth about Lucas. But time was running out, and the feeling of being watched was becoming increasingly oppressive. The auction was about to begin, and Emma knew this was the moment to act. She pressed Lucas against her chest. The baby, now calmer, seemed to feel the same tension as she did. His large, curious eyes observed everything around him, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Emma had no doubt that Lucas was more connected to what was happening than she could imagine. He was the key, not just to Ashford and Carver's secret, but to something much bigger. "It's time," said Thomas, his voice low, almost inaudible. "We need to get to Ashford now." But as they began to move forward, something unexpected happened. Before they could take a step, a figure appeared in front of them. Carver. He stood there, decisively blocking their path. His gaze was icy, and there was something in his posture that suggested he knew exactly what they were trying to do. "Do you really think you can infiltrate here and get away unscathed, Emma?" Carver said with a cruel smile. "I thought you were smarter, but you underestimated what's at stake." Emma stood firm, not backing down. "You're wrong, Carver. I didn't underestimate anything. I know exactly what you're trying to do, and I'm not going to let it happen." He took a step forward, and that's when the surprise occurred. Lucas, who until that moment had been calm, suddenly began to emit an intense vibration. The environment around them seemed to tremble slightly, as if something was about to break. The gleam in Lucas's eyes intensified, and the energy in the air became palpable. "No!" Carver shouted, surprise evident in his voice. "He can't control it." Emma looked at Lucas, who seemed to be reacting to Carver's presence, as if recognizing the threat. The truth about the baby's power was now at stake, and Emma understood at that moment what was really happening. Lucas wasn't just a baby with special abilities. He was a key to something more, something that Carver and Ashford wanted to control but couldn't master. "Now," Emma said, looking at Thomas. She already knew what to do. "We need to make him reveal everything." The next instant, Lucas's vibration intensified even further. The entire room seemed to vibrate with the energy released by the baby, and suddenly, something incredible happened. One of the rare artifacts being auctioned, an ancient jade statue, began to glow, emitting a blinding light. Everyone in the room, including Ashford and Carver, was stunned, unable to comprehend what was happening. Lucas's energy was somehow connected to the artifacts. It was destabilizing the balance of the room, causing the rare objects and the truth about them to surface. The revelation was instantaneous. Lucas's power was linked to these artifacts in an inexplicable way, and as the light intensified, Emma saw Ashford's gaze turn to panic. "No, it's not possible," Ashford shouted, beginning to back away. "You can't do this." But it was too late. The truth was exposed. Lucas, with his newfound power, had opened a door that no one, not even Ashford or Carver, could close. What began as a search for rare and powerful objects had now transformed into a struggle for the true understanding of an ancient power, and Emma was the key to it all. When the light finally dissipated, everything fell silent. The artifacts began to rearrange themselves, as if controlled by an invisible force. Ashford and Carver panicked, unsure what to do, while Emma, holding Lucas tightly, knew the battle was only beginning. The whole room now knew. Lucas wasn't just a baby. He was the bearer of a power that could change everyone's destiny, and Emma, his mother, was ready to use it to dismantle the web of corruption and power that tried to control their lives. The auction room was in complete chaos, with powerful figures scrambling in all directions, trying to understand what had happened. The artifacts were now out of control, and the light emanating from Lucas had dissipated, but the impact of what he had unleashed still reverberated. Emma stood with Lucas in her arms, watching as the powerful fell upon one another, searching for explanations that could no longer be found. The game had changed, and revenge somehow had already been achieved. She looked at Thomas, who seemed as stunned as the others around them. They had achieved more than they had hoped for. Not only had they destabilized the corruption network led by Ashford and Carver, but they had also uncovered the truth about Lucas. The baby's power was not only linked to the artifacts, but to the ancestral lineage of the collectors, a lineage that, for centuries, had hunted and used powerful magical artifacts to control the world from the shadows. Ashford, now pale and breathless, was being restrained by a group of security guards. Carver, on the other hand, seemed to have completely lost control, shouting incessantly. "You don't know what you've done!" he yelled, but no one seemed to listen. His empire was crumbling before his eyes. Emma, head held high and body tense, knew that the real battle was not lost, but won. She held Lucas in her arms, but the baby was no longer just a symbol of her own survival. He represented true strength, the capacity for change that no one could control. "This isn't over," she whispered to herself, "but it's only just beginning." She knew that the world around her wouldn't change overnight, and that the fight against the dark forces that had manipulated power for so long was far from over. However, at that moment, she also knew she was no longer alone. Lucas, with his immense and uncontrollable power, would not be a tool in the hands of criminals. He would be the key to justice, the only thing capable of breaking the cycle of corruption and impunity that had dominated the world. With Tomas by her side and Lucas in her arms, Emma turned, and for the first time, felt that the future was in her hands. They would no longer be hunted. They had the power now, the power to dismantle the network of influence that had dominated the shadows. And with that, a new chapter began. Emma knew that deep down, the real battle would never be just against Ashford or Carver. She was fighting against the very system that had created them. And this would be a journey that would demand more than strength. It would be a journey of resistance, of strategy, and above all, of understanding the true power that Lucas represented. She knew the road ahead would be tortuous, but she also knew that, with Lucas and Tomas by her side, nothing would be impossible. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the city. It was a new day, and the world was about to change. Months had passed since the day the auction turned into chaos. Emma and Lucas, now safe, had disappeared from the headlines, as if they had never existed. Tomas, who had become their closest ally, now led a clandestine network, helping those who, like them, had been targeted by the corrupt system that controlled the market for rare artifacts. But on the horizon, a shadow still loomed. Ashford and Carver were out of the picture, but those truly responsible for their rise remained hidden. Emma knew that as long as there was power, the fight would never end. And Lucas, with his uncontrollable power, was the key. And you, reader? What would you do in Emma's place? With such great power in her hands, what would your choice be? The fight against the shadows of power is never easy, and Emma and Lucas's journey is far from over. The truth always comes to light, but the price for that truth is high. Now that the game has changed, what will be the next step for those who control the pieces? Share your reflections on the story and join the fight for justice. After all, we all have something to learn from Emma's challenges.